In the lead up to the current crisis, the United States and NATO worked for months to engage Russia to avert war. I met with them in person, talked to them many times on the phone. Time and again, we offered real diplomacy and concrete proposals to strengthen European security, enhance transparency, build confidence on all sides. But Putin and Russia met each of the proposals with disinterest in any negotiation, with lies and ultimatums. Russia was bent on violence from the start. I know not all of you believed me and us when we kept saying they are going to cross the border, they are going to attack. Repeatedly, he asserted we had no interest in war, guaranteed he would not move. Repeatedly saying he would not invade Ukraine. Repeatedly saying Russian troops along the border were there for training, all 180,000 of them. There's simply no justification or provocation for Russia's choice of war. It's an example of one of the oldest human impulses, using brute force and disinformation to satisfy a craving for absolute power and control. It's nothing less than a direct challenge to the rule-based international order established since the end of World War II. And it threatens to return to decades of war that ravaged Europe before the international rule-based order was put in place. We cannot go back to that. We cannot.
In 1963, John F. Kennedy challenged Soviet tyranny in Europe by declaring all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. In 1987, Ronald Reagan stood at Brandenburg Gate and demanded Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. A generation later, the 46th President of the United States delivered his own stinging rebuke of Russian barbarism and once again divided the world. As David Rothkopf writes, between the forces of democracy and those of autocracy, between those who value freedom and those who fear it. In historic Old Warsaw, President Biden again guaranteed that every inch of NATO territory would be defended, reached out to the Russian people, prayed for the plight of millions of refugees, and delivered what many consider to be the most important foreign policy speech of the 21st century. Earlier in the day, he castigated Vladimir Putin, calling him a butcher. And then, in his speech at the Royal Castle in Warsaw, Joe Biden said the quiet part out loud.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principle, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
That his staff tried to walk those comments back had echoes of the reaction to Reagan's evil empire speech and his hot mic moment when the Gipper joked during an audio check about bombing Russia.
I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
All right, Joe Biden's remarks were far more tame, but likely still put the Kremlin back on its heels, which some argue is a good thing. This morning, we gauged the impact of Biden's proclamations in Poland. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Monday, March 28th, a special day for me. It's my dad's birthday today, which it's really symbolic. With us, we have former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, now Director for the Institute for International Studies at Stanford, and NBC News International Affairs Analyst Michael McFaul, author and columnist at the Daily Beast, David Rothkopf, former N.ato Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He's Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and also with us in just a moment, U.S. National Editor of the Financial Times, Ed Luce.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let's talk about the speech, the historic nature of the speech. And yes, the ad-libbed lines, which actually, as far as psyops goes, was the most important part of the speech. Because I'm wondering, Mr. Ambassador, if it's not nice for once that it is not Vladimir Putin defining the terms of the debate and keeping us guessing, but instead it's Vladimir Putin who's wondering whether he has to sleep with one eye open.
Well, first, Joe, I thought it was a fantastic speech. It was a very important speech. It laid out the difference between democracy and dictatorship, between good and evil. He was clear as day where he stood and where the Western world needed to stand. I hope it will be followed up with more action. That's what Kiev wants. That's what President Zelensky wants. But I think it was a very historic speech and the right speech. And the last part, I would just say a couple of things. First of all, it's not the first time President Biden has said this. I traveled with him in Moscow when he was the vice president. And in March of 2011, he said President Putin, Prime Minister Putin back then, should not run for a third term. He said it back then. This is nothing new. And he spoke out loud when I think hundreds of millions of people around the world, including, by the way, millions of Russians, also think. And third, let's be very clear. People jump from he should not remain in power to saying that he called for regime change. That is not true. He didn't say we should have a regime change. He said this one person should not remain in power. And most certainly he wasn't changing U.S. policy by advocating a policy of regime change. So all in all, I think it was, it wasn't in his speech. He's known to do this. But sometimes saying these things have a purpose, as you just rightly pointed out when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire back in 1983, and everybody said, oh my goodness, this is shocking what he said. Now we all remember that as a very clear statement of the truth back then.
And it's in a very strong message, Admiral Stavridis, to dissidents in Russia. And you heard after the fall of the Soviet Union, you heard dissidents saying that when Reagan and other Western leaders would say things like that, it sent a strong message. And by the way, as far as Joe Biden saying things like this, you don't have to go back to 2011 or 2012. He said it at the end of his State of the Union address, and it was clearly planned. As he's walking away from the mic, he says, let's go get him. A clear psyops message to Vladimir Putin.
Joe, first and foremost, as you point out, there are different audiences here. You're absolutely right. There's a Russian audience, which, let's face it, is kind of split between those who support Putin, but many, and their numbers are growing, who do not support Putin. So I think that's a strong part of this. Secondly, it's the Europeans who come away from this reassured. I mean, my phone bangs from friends in NATO days as Supreme Allied Commander absolutely lit up at this speech, and it will continue to do so. It was a speech of immense reassurance to our allies. And then finally, Joe, I think it was a good explanatory speech to the American public, one that soared into the rhetoric of why this matters, hope and light, democracy. And I think he laid it out strongly, and he delivered it strongly. And then finally, when I think back on this speech, I'm not going to be thinking about, did he call for regime change or not? I think Mike McFaul describes that one very well. To me, this speech is called the sacred obligation speech. He talked about our sacred obligation to NATO, and it will also be the don't even think about it speech, kind of the American vernacular. Don't even think about it, Vladimir. I think a strong speech and delivered in a context in Warsaw, a city destroyed in the Second World War and rebuilt. We don't want that again. I think it was a strong speech and sent the right messages.
And David, you wrote some beautiful words about this speech afterwards, about the clear lines that it drew. It's so interesting, though, a lot of the bad faith actors on the Trump right who have been criticizing Joe Biden for being too weak, now criticizing Joe Biden for being too strong, and really revealed themselves after that speech for just how pathetic and how un-American they are in attacking the American president in a time like this. Let's talk about, though, your reaction to it and how you believe that Joe Biden finally did divide the world again against democracy against the forces of autocracy?
Well, Joe Biden has been speaking since the campaign about a world divided between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy. And of course, what we've seen in Ukraine is a flare-up in that conflict. And I think it was extremely important that he went right up to the edge of the dividing line that now sits across Europe. And he said, we are going to stand up to this. We are going to fight for this. We are going to support Ukraine. We are not going to be cowed. You know, past administrations have been hesitant to stand up to Putin. He was not hesitant to stand up to Putin. I think the message of the speech from beginning to end was of strength. And I also think that it was a speech that resonated not just in the context of Ukraine, but in the context of a shift. The United States and Europe and our allies are looking at Russia in terms of a long-term threat. They are not going to be satisfied simply to end this war, hopefully to win this war, but they are going to require that Russia stays where it is, that it stops its talk of aggression. And I think finally, as to your first point about the incredible hypocrisy of the Republicans who've taken both sides of this issue as they had so many others, that, you know, this dividing line between autocracy and democracy is not a remote foreign issue. We are fighting that war right here, right now, with people like Donald Trump and others in his party seeking to undermine American democracy and embrace hallmarks of authoritarian governments. So, historical speech, strong, and significant resonance both at home and abroad.
And many,
all around the world.
All around the world. And yeah, many of those Trumpists are actually having their words played on Russian television to again, try to inspire the Russian people to keep killing more Ukrainians.
Now,
it's not a good look, especially, Mika, when many of these same people were the very ones in the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party who also celebrated Ronald Reagan's evil empire speech, who also celebrated Ronald Reagan joking and saying that the bombing would begin in 5 minutes. Again, it's just pure hypocrisy. They're not concerned about what's best for America. They're not concerned about what's best for democracy. They're not concerned about what's best for Western civilization. They just want Joe Biden to fail,
right,
or any Democrat to fail.
There's no time for that.
You really do wonder how twisted somebody's worldview would be when we're in the middle of the most critical foreign policy challenge since the end of World War II.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do it.
I usually sort of try and take a look at how other networks are covering. Right now, I can't even be bothered by that. There's so much at stake, and there's no time for this silly season, for this behavior. Quite frankly, it's a behavior passed on by Donald Trump. President Biden's visit to Poland was an historic bookend to his 4-day trip to Europe. He began by meeting with the troops from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division stationed near Poland's border with Ukraine, helping to bolster NATO's eastern flank. He actually took a lot of selfies and decided to sit down spontaneously and have pizza with the troops. They loved it. The president also met with Ukrainians at a Warsaw stadium, which had been converted into a refugee center. It got a little chaotic because people were so happy to see him, many in tears. More than 2 million Ukrainians have fled to Poland over the past month. The president tweeted, "You don't need to speak the same language to feel the roller coaster of emotions in their eyes." During a meeting with the Polish president, Biden said, quote, "I'm confident that Vladimir Putin was counting on dividing NATO, but he hasn't been able to do it. We've all stayed together." And Biden capped his trip with a forceful speech denouncing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking in front of a crowd that included Ukrainian refugees, the president framed the war as a fight for democracy and urged Western countries to brace for the road ahead.
In the perennial struggle for democracy and freedom, Ukraine and its people are in the front lines, fighting to save their nation. And their brave resistance is part of a larger fight for an essential democratic principles that unite all free people. My message to the people of Ukraine is a message I delivered today to Ukraine's foreign minister and defense minister, who I believe are here tonight. We stand with you, period. Don't even think about moving on one single inch of NATO territory. We have sacred obligation. We have a sacred obligation under Article 5 to defend each and every inch of NATO territory with the full force of our collective power.
So, Ambassador McFaul, I want to again just follow up with what the president said there, but also what Admiral Stavridis had said. This was his "don't even think about it" speech, and it was. After Vladimir Putin threatening nuclear war for 3-4 weeks, after TV mouthpieces on Russian television threatening nuclear war, after who else? Ambassadors, diplomats from Russia threatening nuclear war if we do everything. And their mistake was they took it down to even economic sanctions. This is Joe Biden saying, you know what? Enough of your threats. Don't even think about this. We've drawn a line. And to the people of Ukraine, we stand with you, period, full stop. It was a strong message and a real shove, pushback, Vladimir Putin. I want to ask you, how important is that speech now to the people of Ukraine? How important will it be in years to come? How will we look back on this speech if Ukraine ultimately prevails in this war?
Well, that's a big if. That's the key if. If they prevail, this speech will be considered historic. If they don't, and if we don't do enough to help them, the speech will not be remembered. And I think that's the key thing. I agree rhetorically, it was a great speech. Explain the narrative. I completely agree with David. It was the best explanation of what the stakes are that we've heard from the president so far. I also agree with Admiral Stavridis, not 1 inch, don't touch NATO. That statement also needed to be made. But the other phrase I think was very important is he started by quoting Pope John Paul II when he first came to Poland, in communist Poland. He said, "Be not afraid." And that, I think, was a message to our allies, but I think that was also a message to us. Because all this nuclear rattle, saber rattling, and we got to be afraid of escalation from Vladimir Putin, that was not a position of strength, in my view. That was them overstating things to make us afraid to do things to help the Ukrainians. I think the president laid it out very clearly that we are not afraid, that we are strong, and now we have to follow up that rhetoric with concrete action. The concrete action that President Zelensky keeps calling for: more weapons and more sanctions.
Well, and Admiral, I want to ask you that President Zelensky asked for more planes, more tanks, anti-missile weapons, anti-ship weapons. How critical is it that, without making a big announcement, without discussing it on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, how important is it to get those weapons into the hands of the Ukrainian fighters?
It's the absolute center of gravity of this fight. It's the will of the Ukrainians to resist. And it's personified, of course, by President Zelensky. We had to be listening. And frankly, again, we've kind of pulled out all the Churchill references, but I'm going to pull out one more, which is Churchill in the run-up to World War II saying to Roosevelt, "Give us the tools, we will finish the job." And I think at the end of the day, putting those weapons in the hands of the Ukrainians across the spectrum of violence is crucial. Second and final point on this, Joe, it's not just about what we do in Ukraine, to Ambassador McFaul's excellent point. It's also what is NATO doing. And oh, by the way, we just added battle groups in all the nations on the south flank of Russia. We already have battle groups to the north. They're not there to invade Russia. Russia knows that. We know that. They're defensive. It's a defensive alliance, but we overmatch Russia in conventional forces by overwhelming numbers. NATO needs to continue to push its forces forward, and we need to collectively put the tools that President Zelensky and his brave fighters need in their hands.
Ed Luce, as a historian, I want your takeaway on the president's speech and the words that are so controversial. I feel like spending an afternoon with those refugees and with the troops would steel him for every word that he said in that speech.
Yeah, I would agree with the consensus. This has the makings, potentially, of an historic speech, depending, as Mike McFaul says, on whether it's upheld in practice in the coming weeks. You know, I think the comment about wishing Putin would go is a little bit of a storm in a teacup. It's clearly what Biden wishes. It's what we all wish. It's what Macron wishes. It's what all Western counterparts to Biden wish. Some confusion as to whether that would become NATO's official war aim. I think pretty strenuously corrected by the White House. People give a little bit of slack to Biden for saying what he thinks sometimes at inopportune moments. So I think this is probably overblown. What's most interesting to me about words coming from the region at the moment is what Zelensky is saying. And Zelensky is asking for as many weapons as possible. He wants all kinds of weapons, all kinds of tanks, anti-tank weapons, anti-missile, anti-aircraft missiles. He wants more, and he wants them quickly. And with the exception of Hungary, every single neighbor on the western side is a conduit for these weapons. So that's going to be the test of the rhetoric of Biden's speech, is do those munitions come in now at a flow and at a pace that Zelensky needs. And Zelensky's given a couple of interviews in the last, over the weekend, one of which to a bunch of Russian journalists, which of course has been banned in Russia, and another to The Economist, in which he's been very explicit about splits within the West, or difference of emphasis within the West. Very critical of Germany for continuing to want to buy Russian energy, and of France. Macron, he said, is afraid to send tanks into Ukraine. And then others like Britain, Poland, the Baltics, he's saying, are stepping up. But I suppose that's important, because if Zelensky's now beginning to call out differences within the Western alliance, and Biden's words produce different reactions in the Western alliance, then we do have to pay attention to keeping unity in the Western alliance. And I think that's going to become an issue in the coming days, that there are some sort of Frances and Germanys that are beginning to hang back a little bit.
So, Joe, we were watching the speech together, of course, and I just wonder if some administrations who are very quick to regroup on that off-the-cuff remark might have wanted to wait a beat and just say it's what the president felt. Because I think the walk back is the weakness. It's what the president felt.
Now, I just say, for everybody that's been criticizing, first of all, criticizing the president for saying it, and then criticizing the staff for walking it back, grow up. This is what we can deal with. And David, I'm sure you agree with me. Creative ambiguity, that's a really good thing right now. Because we've been hearing Lavrov say something, and the West races after those remarks. And then 3 hours later, Putin will say something harder. Well, what are they saying? What are they meaning? You know, we've been out front saying exactly what we're for, what we're doing, what's going on. I'm not just saying this. Listen, I said it when Reagan was president. I like the creative ambiguity. I like a president that goes out and calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. I know the State Department freaked out at the time. The diplomatic corps freaked out at the time. That's fine. Creative ambiguity. Keep them guessing. David, your thoughts?
Vladimir Putin is a serial war criminal who is committing, as we speak, crimes against humanity. He's leveled an entire innocent neighbor. He did the same thing in Syria. He did the same thing in Chechnya. I don't think we should be that concerned with hurting his feelings. I think this is a time to, call him what he is and let him know that this is not a moment in the West where there is a lack of resolve or unity. Ed's point is an important one, but I think the administration has done a great job keeping the West together. I think there's been a lot of support in NATO, within the EU, and I think that is going to continue. But I do agree with Mike's point. President Zelensky is right. It is essential that we don't just have strong words, and that every morning the leaders within the Western Alliance wake up and say, what else can we do for Ukraine today? Because we're at a moment that we didn't think was possible a month ago, where Ukraine could push Russia back, where Ukraine can achieve real victories. And I think it is absolutely right. Let's give them the tools to do that.